50 years ago, a series of dramatic events unfolded that would forever change the lives of countless Vietnamese families and ultimately reshape communities across America. I'm standing on the flight deck of the USS Midway in San Diego, surrounded by thousands of Vietnamese Americans who've gathered to commemorate what they call Black April, the fall of Saigon, and the beginning of a massive exodus from their homeland. The images of that time are seared into our collective memory. Desperate crowds on rooftops, helicopters hovering overhead, people clinging to the skids as they lifted off. But what happened in those chaotic days of April 1975, and in the months and years that followed, is more nuanced, more impactful, and more far-reaching than you might think. This episode is the first in a three-part series exploring how a community transformed by war has flourished in the 50 years since Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in U.S. military history. The story of this community challenges the conventional narrative of America's involvement in Vietnam. In the American public discourse about the war's legacy, people typically speak in terms of what was lost, namely more than 58,000 American lives, not counting those who would later die from war-related causes. At VVMF and at Echoes, we work hard to highlight some of the prouder aspects of that legacy, especially the many ways that Vietnam veterans and their generation have impacted American life militarily, politically, and culturally. But standing here today, surrounded by Vietnamese American families, I realize that there's an essential part of that legacy that I've overlooked. And it's been hiding in plain sight for 50 years. In this series, we'll meet military personnel who facilitated the evacuation, Vietnamese families who fled in terror, and their children and grandchildren who've built remarkable lives here in America. Their stories reveal how, from the trauma of displacement, a vibrant community emerged, one that stands as living proof that America's involvement in Vietnam produced outcomes far more positive and enduring than we often acknowledge.
If you want to start with reconciliation, with healing, let's start right here in America, right here in your own backyard. You don't need to go to Vietnam and fraternize with the former enemy. Your brothers are here, right here.
Stick around. From the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, founders of The Wall, this is Echoes of the Vietnam War. I'm your host, Michael Crone, bringing you stories of service, sacrifice, and healing from people who still feel the impact of that conflict more than 50 years later. Episode 96, The Fall and the Flight. Right after this.
Hi, I'm Ann Margaret. I went to Vietnam to entertain the troops in 1966 and 1968. My guys, my gentlemen, if you lived through the Vietnam War era, you know the impact that the war had. But today, we are in danger of history being lost. Current generations know very little about the war, or the people who served. As more of our Vietnam vets pass away each day, their stories are being lost to history. Together, we can change that. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund is the organization that built the wall. It works to ensure that future generations will understand the war's impact. Let's help keep the promise that the wall was built on. Never forget. Visit vvmf.org to find out how you can get involved.
Saigon didn't fall overnight. By early 1975, American combat forces had long departed, and the South Vietnamese military was struggling to hold back North Vietnamese advances. Carl Zingheim, staff historian for the USS Midway Museum, explains how these final months unfolded.
Well, by the spring of 1975, things were getting dire for American interests in Indochina. The North Vietnamese had started another preliminary offensive that, to their surprise, actually started to gain ground by March of 1975. And concurrently, things were really going downhill rapidly in Laos and Cambodia. And so the decision was made to evacuate American government personnel and other important personages out of those two countries by helicopter, and that became Operation Eagle Pole, which was accomplished in March of 1975. In fact, it went so well that it kind of primed the pump for what became Operation Frequent Wind the following month off South Vietnam. And so as the military situation really deteriorated in the Central Highlands region of South Vietnam, the decision was made in Washington that it looks like South Vietnam's not going to make it, and we're going to have to perform a similar evacuation effort, albeit a larger one, out of Saigon.
As North Vietnamese forces advanced, the U.S. military prepared what would become the largest helicopter evacuation in American history. Carl explains how the Midway and other naval vessels were positioned to support this massive operation.
Midway was underway for a routine deployment out of her new home port of Yokosuka when word came when she was off Okinawa that you're going to have to take aboard some Air Force rescue helicopters. These were CSAR squadrons that had perfected their techniques in the latter stages of the Vietnam War, so they were primed and trained and ready to go with long-range heavy-lift helicopters. So Midway offloaded about half of her air wing component in the Philippines to make room for personnel and these Air Force helicopters. And other ships are also of tags, such as several amphibious ships, including the Okinawa, and aircraft carrier Hancock, who had just completed Operation Eagle Pole. She was in Singapore when word suddenly came, everybody get back to the ship, we have to go for another evacuation. So Midway and Hancock and Okinawa, other ships that had short flight decks, were gathered together to stand by. Enterprise led an air cover group, including bringing the newly arrived F-14 Tomcat to provide air cover just in case.
As the situation in Saigon deteriorated, American officials prepared for evacuation. The signal to begin Operation Frequent Wind was both unlikely and iconic.
And so as far as the U.S. military is concerned, they were already standing by in case things really fell apart. And of course, by late April, that's exactly what happened. So the code word for the operation to commence was the playing of Bing Crosby's White Christmas over Armed Forces radio.
I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, just like the ones I used to know.
Once people heard that song on the radio,
American personnel and those in the know knew what that all meant. And originally, Frequent Wind was basically we're pulling out American government officials and other high-ranking South Vietnamese government officials and their families, but as word got out that the Army is not holding and that the North Vietnamese is steadily advancing, the word got out, if you could get out, now's the time to go.
On the ground in Saigon, Douglas Potratz was serving as a Marine Guard at the U.S. Embassy. He had a front row seat to the chaos unfolding as evacuation plans had to be adjusted on the fly.
I was one of the 4 squad leaders there. What we did is we set the compound up in quadrants, in a 4-man quadrant, and each quadrant had one of the walls to the embassy to guard. We had the vehicle gate during the evacuation of Saigon. The evacuation started a little bit late for the embassy because most of the people were supposed to be evacuated at Tan Son Nhut, the DAO compound. but we were finding out that people couldn't get transportation to Tan Son Nhut, and some of the Vietnamese were not letting buses or anything in. So they brought them back to the embassy. Attached to the embassy, it was a compound called the CRA compound, Combined Recreational Association. They had a swimming pool there, and we used that for a staging area for the people. We set up a helipad. There was one already on the roof, and we set one up in the parking lot of the embassy.
As the evacuation continued into the night, the situation grew increasingly dire. Potratz recalls the final hours at the embassy.
The call came out that there weren't going to be any more helicopters. We still had about 400 people left in the compound. So we went into the embassy because we were going to use the helicopter pad on the roof of the embassy. So we locked up the embassy, we went up the stairwell, and we secured the stairwell up there. Somebody in the compound, we had left a fire truck there in case one of the helicopters caught fire. They took the they took the fire truck and they crashed through the doors of the embassy, and then they went up to the roof where we were at, but we had one more door left. We barricaded that, and then we waited. When we were up there, we didn't know how many helicopters we would get or when they were coming. The sun came up, and we waited about 2 or 3 hours. And then finally, a few helicopters came and picked up the last Marines.
For Potratz, the weight of what was happening hit hard. The evacuation represented not just a military operation, but the end of a long and costly American involvement in Southeast Asia.
It was almost crushing because the war had gone on for 10 years. There were 52,000 people that died, and this was the end. We were leaving for good. It felt very bad. It felt like we had lost the war, and we were responsible for it, but we tried everything we could to help as many people out as we could. We ended up evacuating about 7,000 people by helicopter. And that's still the record for the largest helicopter evacuation in U.S. history.
Meanwhile, out at sea, Edward Frank Jr. was aboard the USS Enterprise, witnessing the evacuation from a different perspective. Frank, whose father had been killed while serving as a Green Beret in Vietnam in 1967, was now watching the final chapter of America's involvement unfold before his eyes.
We were at the end of our 6-month tour on the Enterprise, and we were near the South China Sea, and we got orders. The Captain C.C. Smith, came over the 1MC over the ship's intercom and told us that our cruise has been extended by 2 months. And of course, we're all geared up heading home, and now we're turning around and going back. And we were going to go and participate in an operation. I don't remember if he gave the details at the time, but I remember we were off the coast of Vietnam at the start of this, and I'm going to guess maybe we were about 20 miles off the coast. It might have been farther. I'm trying to remember. I remember at night, right before the evacuation or maybe during it, we could see, at night, we could see the rocket fire going. And I said, the war's still going on over there. We were sitting there on the flight deck, we were at Ready Cat and everything, but I could see the rocket fire going, and that stood out in my mind. I thought, this is serious business that we're here. And then I realized that we were evacuating people.
For the South Vietnamese, this wasn't just serious business. It was the end of their country as they knew it. Many devastated families suddenly faced impossible choices about whether to stay and take their chances under communism or flee into the unknown and risk never seeing their homeland again. As people flooded to evacuation points, Operation Frequent Wind faced immense logistical challenges. What's fascinating to me is how much of this operation was improvised on the spot. Carl Zingheim describes the scene as helicopters descended on American ships waiting offshore.
A lot of aircraft were being frantically commandeered amongst the South Vietnamese Air Force inventory. A great many tactical aircraft flew westwards over into Thailand, but anything that could land on a ship theoretically, like the helicopters, were frantically being taken over and sent out to sea to find the first ship they could possibly land on. So not only was it a steady transfer of the Air Force helicopters coming aboard Midway and similar things with the Hancock and the Okinawa, suddenly an armada of helicopters, many of them seriously overloaded beyond design capacity that are barely in stable flight, are also showing up, and they can't merely be waved off. And so all the crews on the various ships had to improvise, working with their air bosses to make sure there weren't any collisions as these machines are swarming all about, and getting enough room for them to land, offload people, shut down, and if necessary, pitching the machine over the side, such as UH-1 Hueys or even the larger H-47 Chinook helicopter. A couple of those wound up having to go in the drink amongst the various ships just to make room because there's another one coming in.
Think about that for a second. They were pushing helicopters overboard into the sea. These weren't cheap pieces of equipment. Each Huey cost about $1 million in today's dollars. But there was simply no alternative if they wanted to make room for more incoming flights. As the helicopters continued to arrive, the crew of the Midway worked at an astonishing pace to process the evacuees.
Midway took on, by one count, 3,073 people. Now that doesn't mean...
That's in a, 2-day period?
Over about, less than 48 hours. And they didn't necessarily stay aboard. They were also being transshipped with the ship's own helicopters to other vessels that could be detached and sent to the Philippines or wherever for refugee processing. But as far as people who alighted on the deck and eventually made their way to freedom, Midway took aboard 3,073 civilians. The flight deck division really worked around the clock, literally. You caught some sleep whenever you could because the next emergency, because every flight coming in was an emergency flight. And that's something that can get lost in translation. Sure, the Air Force folks were doing a professional job, but it was the influx of all these South Vietnamese aircraft where every single one of them was an emergency inbound. That's something you don't run into even in the fleet every single day.
Right.
It's also a strain, of course, for the extra hours that were being put in, having to be attentive all the time. I just think it is an absolute miracle we didn't have any deck crashes. When you consider you had untrained Vietnamese personnel who knew a certain type of flying, they don't understand shipboard procedures and all that. They're flying aircraft for the most part that are dangerously overloaded with questionable aerodynamic stability, and yet enough professionalism prevailed amongst them, and of course with our own deck crews. We didn't have a single flight deck accident.
Among the many dramatic moments of the evacuation, there's one that stands out as indelible. The landing of a small Cessna 01 Bird Dog, piloted by a South Vietnamese major with his entire family aboard. A wife and 5 children. It's a story that has become legend in the annals of Operation Frequent Wind.
The real drama occurred on the second day when everybody thought the evacuation had ended, on the 30th, when an 01 Bird Dog, a Cessna aircraft, arrived flying out of Con Son with a Vietnamese major, his wife, and his 5 children crammed aboard a 2-seat airplane. And so he couldn't possibly ditch in the water because he's got fixed landing gear, so they'll pitch right over as soon as the tires hit the sea. So conferring with Captain Chambers, our air boss, Vern Jumper, decided we're going to take him aboard, even though he's not a naval aviator and he's not flying a tailhook aircraft.
This little Cessna was neither designed nor equipped to land on an aircraft carrier. For one thing, it has no tailhook. Added to which, the pilot, Major Buang Lee, had never landed on a ship before, and he had no radio contact with the Midway. He simply dropped a note from the cockpit that said, "Can you move the helicopters to the other side? I can land on your runway. I can fly for 1 hour more. Please rescue me."
We were 100 nautical miles at sea, and he didn't have enough gas to make it back to the beach.
Admiral Larry Chambers, now 96 years old, was a captain on the Midway during Operation Frequent Wind. Here he is, addressing the crowd assembled on the Midway for the 50th anniversary commemoration.
I ordered Vern Jumper, and he's sitting over there, to make a ready deck. Vern suggested that I had lost my mind. But I told him I would give him some help, and I got on the ship's general announcing system, and I ordered all air wing and air department people not on watch to report to the flight deck to give Vern a little help. Well, as it turns out, not only did we get the air department and the air wing personnel on the flight deck, I think somewhere in that melee, about 2,000 men showed up for the working party to help Vern make a ready deck. I figured that little airplane had an approach speed somewhere around 60 knots, and if I got 40 knots of wind over the deck, that he was going to have to try real hard to catch me. But I knew we had enough runway at that point. With that much wind over the deck, I probably had the equivalent of about a 2,500-foot runway. And I didn't know how much experience Major Lee had in this airplane, but I think he had probably somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 hours. And first of all, you got to be a total idiot to come out and think you've never made a carrier landing in his life, and finds a carrier out there that's totally clobbered, and to think that somebody's going to push $100 million worth of stuff over the side to give him permission to land. Two of us together. He lost his mind first, and I had the admiral yelling at me. I lost mine. Look, I didn't own any of those. Not a single thing I pushed over the side had U.S. Navy on it. It had U.S. Air Force, U.S. Army, Air America. I didn't own them. So I gave the Major a little help by clearing the runway for him. By the way, we had no communications, so the only way we could use them, we signaled them with the Aldous lamps: red light, you can't land; green light, deck's clear. And just as we had turned into the wind, everything was all set up. 8 more Hueys out of Saigon landed right in the middle of the deck. Vern wanted to know, what the hell are we going to do now? And I told Vern, 8 more over the side wasn't going to make any difference in how long I spent in jail. Push us over too. After his successful landing, Midway's crew was so impressed with Major Lee that they collected over $10,000 in 1975. That was big bucks. And we forwarded it to him to help him and his family get settled in America. In the midst of the ongoing chaos, I had a brief interview with Major Lee on the bridge. I took off my wings, and I had the Major up there. I gave him my wings and made him a naval aviator right on the spot. I mean, you got to be crazy. Something he'd never done in his life before. Before any of these aviators around here ever saw a carrier, they made thousands of landings on the beach to teach them how to make carrier landings. And this guy walks out there and decides that he's going to become one. I mean, look, he's the bravest man I've ever met in my life, and I must be the dumbest one to think that we could make it happen, okay? But he's the bravest guy I ever knew, and all I was a real estate manager. I just cleared the runway to give him a shot at it.
While Operation Frequent Wind successfully evacuated thousands of Vietnamese people, it was just the beginning of a much larger exodus that would continue for decades. We'll dig into that after a short break. If you're enjoying Echoes of the Vietnam War, I want to let you know about some very easy ways you can help to support the podcast. Here are 3 ideas ranked from easiest to hardest, and the hardest is still pretty easy. Number 1, spread the word. Tell a friend or 2 friends, or better yet, share a favorite episode on your social media accounts so you can let all of your friends know in one go. Number 2, leave us a review or a rating wherever you get your podcasts. Even if you stream Echoes directly from our website, you can still send feedback through the form at the bottom of the page. Number 3, if you're listening from our website, consider following or subscribing on one of the many platforms where podcasts are found, including Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and many more. That way, you'll always have the most recent episode automatically downloaded to your mobile device, and you'll boost our subscription numbers, which will help new listeners find us more easily. Thank you so much for just listening. We really appreciate your continued attention to these stories. We'll be extra grateful for your help in spreading the word about Echoes so more people can check out the work we're doing. Let's talk about the wall for a minute. It is widely considered to be the memorial that changed memorials forever. Its design invites a level of engagement, of introspection, of reverence that no fountain, no statue of a cannon or a man on a horse could ever match. The volunteers who work there often talk about wall magic, that unexpected, often spiritual connection or discovery that happens when you visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It's one of the reasons why the wall's design has inspired so many other memorials around the world. Of course, there is one little problem with the wall's design. 140 panels of polished black granite aren't exactly portable. So, unless you can get yourself to Washington, D.C., how are you supposed to experience wall magic for yourself? Well, guess what? We already thought of that. In 1996, VVMF unveiled an exact replica of the wall that could be packed into an 18-wheeler and hauled to cities and towns all across America. Since then, the wall that heals has been displayed in more than 800 communities throughout the nation, spreading the healing legacy of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial to millions of visitors. Sure, there are other versions of the wall that travel around the country, but the wall that heals is the only one that is an exact replica of the one in Washington, created and maintained by the same organization that built the wall in the first place. And not only that, the wall that heals is accompanied and curated by VVMF employees who work with host communities to ensure that the experience is as close as possible to the real thing. And that includes wall magic. But you don't have to take my word for it. You can check out episode 15 of this podcast to learn what happens to people's hearts when this traveling exhibit rolls into a real-life American community. The Wall That Heals and the mobile education center that travels with it will be in Liberty, South Carolina, May 15 through 18, and Shaler Township, Pennsylvania, May 23 through 26. To see the rest of this year's tour schedule and to learn how you can bring the Wall That Heals to your town, visit vvmf.org. Operation Frequent Wind rescued approximately 7,000 people in those chaotic April days of 1975. But in the years that followed, More than 1 million more Vietnamese would flee their homeland under increasingly desperate circumstances. Anyone who had served in the South Vietnamese government or its military was in particular danger, and many of them had known only war since they were old enough to form memories.
They had been fighting that war for decades. By the time the Americans entered the war, they had been fighting for 15 years.
That's historian Julie Pham. She was born in Vietnam and fled with her parents by boat in January 1979 when she was just 2 months old. She went on to earn a PhD in history from the University of Cambridge, and in 2019 she published Their War, The Perspectives of the South Vietnamese Military in the Words of Veteran Émigrés, based on her interviews of 40 veterans of the South Vietnamese military now living in the United States.
And also, they weren't just doing 1 or 2 tours. Once you enter the military, you are in it. And in every household, there was someone serving. And so you were either drafted or you enlisted. And so the number of South Vietnamese serving and just the duration. And so that affects the attitude too, because like, this is just a part of our life. This isn't one tour. We are in it. The war is going to continue and it's endless.
Luc Chung was a member of the South Vietnamese Special Forces who wasn't able to escape during the initial evacuation. His story represents the experience of many who were left behind.
I was captured in Da Nang, outside of Da Nang, about 36 kilometers. At that time, I didn't know that Da Nang already lost. That's why we come out from the jungle, from the mission. The headquarters is abandoned us. That's why we lost. And after all, we got captured. And after that, I spent 6 years in re-education camp. And I got home 1981.
And how long after that did you leave?
Until 1989, I lived. I escaped by boat. And
how long was that crossing?
Only 5 days, 5 nights.
Only 5 days.
But we seeking for freedom, so we don't care.
Pha Lê is an emergency room physician in San Diego. His father, a South Vietnamese naval officer who was evacuated early, made the difficult decision to return to Vietnam because he couldn't leave his pregnant wife and son behind. He was captured almost immediately and spent the next 5 years in what the communists called a re-education camp. Behind this euphemistic name was a brutal reality of hard labor, indoctrination, and deprivation.
The cruelest part about those political prisons is that, I only found out recently that excess of 160,000 veterans from the South Vietnamese armed forces died in those prisons because they were overworked and underfed. And when they tried to escape or mouth off or what have you, they would be executed. They contracted various diseases because of malnutrition. So over 60,000 of them died in the prison. The other cruel thing is that they would feed them, the prisoners, false narratives about their wives, remarrying, about their kids, not remembering them. And there was no hope of release because there was no sentence. It was an indefinite period of time that they were locked up there. If it wasn't for the pressures placed upon the Vietnamese government, the communist Vietnamese government, by the international community as well as mostly the United States, those prison camps would still remain.
Julie Pham's family represents another wave of refugees, those who fled Vietnam by boat in the years following the fall of Saigon. Born in Vietnam in 1978, she was just 2 months old when her family fled to sea. The journey for boat people like Julie's family was extraordinarily dangerous. How dangerous? Consider this. In the decade after the fall of Saigon, somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 Vietnamese died at sea attempting to escape. That's a staggering death toll, and it speaks to just how desperate people were for freedom.
I mean, we were really lucky. We were able to get to Indonesia pretty safely. That was where one of the refugee camps was. There are other boats where they were caught by pirates, and many of them didn't survive. So it wasn't this is a safe choice. This was a choice we have to make because the other choice of staying felt that wasn't a viable option.
For Tuan Nguyen, who later became a renowned sculptor in America, escape from communist oppression came after multiple attempts and time spent in a Vietnamese prison.
So I escaped Vietnam in 1978, I believe, 78, 79, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I took the boat from Vietnam to the ocean, get out from the river to the ocean. So they shot to my boat, killed 3 people in my boat. The girl sit next to me, gets shot by the eye, to the eye, and they put me in jail at the time. So I in jail for a year, forced labor. And then when I get out, my ex-girlfriend at the time escaped Vietnam, go through the border from Vietnam to Cambodia, and then go to Thailand by walking. So she telegrammed to me and say, you should try that route. So she pointed me that direction, and then somehow the people, when I in jail at the first time escaped, they connect me with the guy who walked through Vietnam to Cambodia and Cambodia to Thailand. They have a connection to go to Thailand and trade, get fishing, and then, trade wood, and then come back to Vietnam. So I followed them, me and another guy, follow them across the border from Vietnam to Cambodia and go to the jungle, basically. And at the time, it's a Pol Pot in Cambodia. So we have to cross landmine, basically. We don't know, but that's how they say, hey, if it explode, nothing we can do. Mm. So we follow the guy, walk through the border from Cambodia, from Vietnam to Cambodia to Phnom Penh. And we stay in Phnom Penh, that's the city, the capital of Cambodia.
For those who experienced it firsthand, the fall of Saigon still represents a complex mix of emotions, loss and gratitude, trauma and resilience. They're not just historical events, but living memories that have shaped generations of Vietnamese Americans. Luc Chung, who waited 14 years after the fall of Saigon to make his escape, reflects on what the 50th anniversary means to him.
I remember too many people, my friend, my comrade, died for my country. And the day that my country, my side, it lost to the north. It took everyone have the miserable life. We cannot imagine. Yeah, that's all.
Okay. While the fall of Saigon marked the end of one chapter for the Vietnamese people, it was also the beginning of another. In the chaos and heartbreak of those Black April days in 1975, few could have imagined the vibrant communities that would emerge from this trauma, These successive waves of immigrants, from Operation Frequent Wind evacuees to the boat people, to those who escaped later through third countries, would eventually form lively and colorful Vietnamese American communities. We'll take a closer look at the largest of those communities and how they embraced their blank slate in the land of opportunity in part 2 of this series.
There was a big wave of Vietnamese refugees came to the U.S. They was put in 4 camps, 4 refugee camps. But most people in Camp Pendleton, they moved to Little Saigon.
Growing up, I had a very strong sense of my Vietnamese identity. My parents were always telling us to be a refugee is something to be proud of.
20 years ago, there was one intersection where there was a concentration of Vietnamese businesses and merchants. But I remember when it was just one intersection.
I would like an integrated society, not an isolated one. That's not going to help us grow.
That's 1 week from now. We'll see you then.